Thank you for joining us today. I'm Annie Sleece, Director of Advocacy and Education at the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI Delaware. This event is co-hosted by NAMI Delaware and the Delaware Coalition Against Gun Violence. With me here is Tracy Murphy, their Executive Director, and she'll be leading our panel discussion. Our two agencies have united for this important conversation. Traditionally, suicide prevention has focused on who, when, and why people attempt suicide. While these are all important, we also need to understand the how, or the means, because it plays a crucial role in who survives a suicide crisis. Of those who attempt suicide and survive, 9 out of 10 do not go on to die by suicide. But means matter. Firearm suicides are the most lethal, with 90% of attempts by gun resulting in death. To compare, 4% of non-firearm suicide attempts result in death. Suicide is often an impulsive act. Multiple studies have concluded that the acute period of heightened risk is often only minutes or hours long. In one study, nearly 3/4 of attempt survivors deliberated between 5 minutes and 1 hour before their attempt. 1 hour is the length of time of today's event. Means matter. Across the globe, this holds true. In Sri Lanka, pesticides were the leading method of suicide. When restrictions were put in place to limit access to most toxic pesticides, the suicide rates in Sri Lanka dropped by 50%. In Sri Lanka, it was pesticides. In America, it is guns. Today's discussion is neither anti nor pro gun rights. Today's discussion is a public health discussion. Access to firearms, whether by personal or household ownership, triples the risk of suicide. Today, we will discuss the policies our state has in place to reduce suicide risk. And following the panel discussion, we would like to hear from you about questions, concerns, or comments you have on this subject. Our panel includes Representative Lynn, Officer First Class Colleen Kearns, Young Adult Advocate Jalen Powell, and our first speaker, Mr. Chris Locke, founder of SL24 Foundation. Welcome, Chris.
Okay, how can I get my video? There we go. It says the host has stopped my video.
Oh.
Can we,
Let's see if we can get that turned back on. There we go.
Okay. There we go.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for sharing a little bit of your story.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you for those comments and opening statements. It was very interesting. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Locke, founder of SL24. And for those who do not know me, I'll give you some background. First, I want everybody to know I am a Second Amendment supporter. I agree with the founding fathers' philosophy that every citizen should have the right to bear arms. Now, I know some of you are probably saying, and why did Tracy and Annie invite me to speak today? I'm sure Tracy is asking, why did I have this guy speak today? But you see, not only am I Second Amendment supporter, but I also lost my son, Sean, to suicide. And just like 75 to 80% of all men who end their lives, my son, Sean, used a gun to end his life. 944 days ago, I got the call that changed my life. It was like every other day. It was a beautiful summer day in July. I had a bunch of meetings that day. My phone rang. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and it was my daughter, Catherine, calling me. I answered not knowing that she would say the following: Dad, Sean is dead. Before I could process what she was saying, she followed with, he killed himself. The news literally knocked me to the floor. I crawled under my desk in a fetal position. The news was that horrible. I could not take it. My son Sean was this beautiful 6'4", blonde hair, blue eye, 23-year-old outgoing person. Everyone loved Sean, and Sean loved everyone. He was caring, loving, and generous person. He gave back to his community in so many ways. He was also a gifted athlete. He played on the men's basketball team at the University of Delaware. He realized his boyhood dream of playing in March Madness and playing at Madison Square Garden. He was captain of the team his senior year, a three-time all-academic All-American. He graduated with honors. At graduation, he got a great job at Puccini Poland in Wilmington. As a father, I thought my job was done. All is well. Sean and I were very close. We spoke every day. We spoke about everything except one thing. You see, for all of Sean's success, but how proud I was for all that he had accomplished, Sean never told me he was suffering with depression and anxiety. My little boy suffered for years in silence. As most, if not all of you know, that is the thing about depression. It's an insidious disease. It almost paralyzes the person to be able to verbalize that they need to get help. And if you're an athlete like Sean was, it's almost impossible because they're trained to push through pain. You think, or he thought, you can push through the pain of depression just like he pushed through the pain of physical injury. But we all know this is a fallacy. After we lost Sean, we walked in a fog, and at times we still do. When you lose a child, you lose part of your future. You lose that story that's in your head that you're going to grow old, be surrounded by your kids and your grandkids. My future was changed forever when I got the call that Sean was gone forever. See, the loss of Sean had a great impact on our community. Over 4,000 people came to his viewing and his funeral. He was that loved by so many, yet he was so alone in his suffering with depression and anxiety. After we lost Sean, his family and his friends decided to start a small little foundation. We really had no grand plans. We were just going to do one event and then give the money to a nonprofit. Well, that first event drew 3,000 people, and we raised over $200,000 in one night. At that point, we knew we had an obligation to do more, that Sean's legacy was not going to end on the day that the darkness was so much that he couldn't handle it anymore. So we started SL24, and there's 3 goals: educate, assist, and support. We educate by going to schools, groups, and businesses to speak about removing the stigma of mental illness, youth suicide prevention, and mental health well-being. We assist by helping young adults, 14 to 24-year-olds, and their parents to get the help they need to find a mental health professional, because we know there's such a shortage and such a long waiting time. And then we support by opening on October 1st a place called Sean's House in Newark, Delaware. This was his house, literally. He lived there for 3 years while attending the University of Delaware. And Sean's House is a safe haven so that 14 to 24-year-olds can begin an honest conversation about whatever mental health struggles they are dealing with. And in just 4.5 months since opening, we've had over 700 young adults come in and use the resources we offer. Sean's House is free of charge, and it's open 24 hours, 7 days a week. As I said, Sean ended his life on a beautiful summer day in July, a day in which he and I would have probably been going to one of his baseball games or go see a baseball game. But instead, I was driving to the house he was living at and was told that my son killed himself with a gun. As I said, I am a Second Amendment person, but I do not own a gun. And until that day, Sean had never used a gun in his life. During that horrible day, Sean had found the gun in the house. He didn't know how to use it. How do I know that? Because when we looked at his computer and his iPhone, he went on a search engine and watched the video 5 times of how to load the bullets into the gun. From the time he watched that video, he was gone in 25 minutes. Beautiful life gone after 23 years, gone forever. The work of the Delaware Coalition Against Gun Violence is critical to have an honest conversation about mental illness and guns. The red flag law would not have probably prevented Sean's death, but knowledge of gun safety may have. Having a special password given to gun owners before using and watching instructional videos may have. Having gun owners be mandated to have a gun safe may have. And having legislation to make sure all gun owners are then kept in a gun safe may have. And that is why I'm here today, to say you can support the Second Amendment, but you can also be supportive of the work of the Delaware Against Gun Violence Coalition as well. As Annie said, suicide is a decision usually made in haste. It's almost a panic decision. I have to do something to end the despair and darkness that I'm in. But as we all know, suicide is not the solution. All suicide does is spread the pain and darkness to family and friends. That is the collateral damage of suicide. So through the work of NAMI and Delaware Against Coalition and SL 24, we can hopefully reduce that collateral damage and help those who need help, and then come out of the darkness and into the light. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. That was such a powerful way to begin our event. I'm so grateful for your work, for Sean's legacy, for what you're doing throughout our state. I'm truly speechless. Thank you. So Tracy Murphy has just joined us, and Chris and I are going to exit in just a moment. We'll begin our panel discussion now. And we will resume. We will come back together in just a moment. So I want to thank you all for being here, and Chris and I will be back. Thank you, Tracy.
Sure, thank you. Chris, thank you for sharing so poignantly about Sean. I'm sorry I never met him, although as an avid basketball fan, I am glad to say I enjoyed watching him play many times at the university. And I'm glad I get to know him through your advocacy work in his honor. I'm very grateful to Annie and the NAMI team. Thanks as always for partnering with us. I'm really glad to be here today. Sean's story reinforces how impulsive an act suicide is, and therefore how many opportunities there are to prevent it in moments of crisis, which is what our work at the Delaware Coalition Against Gun Violence is focused upon. When we discuss suicide prevention from a legislative perspective, it's important to recognize that legislation is part of what saves lives, but it needs to be paired with strong community education programming, like the session we're doing today, and strong community intervention strategies, like the ones offered by Sean's House, like the ones offered by NAMI Delaware and other organizations. All of these elements have to be strong and partnered together in order to be effective in preventing suicides in communities. I'm going to focus specifically on 2 pieces of legislation that we already have: the Lethal Violence Protection Order and the Safe Storage Law, both of which passed during previous General Assemblies and were signed into law by Governor Carney. Both of these laws had some bipartisan support, reinforcing our belief and Chris Locke's message that gun violence prevention is not a left or right issue. It is a life or death issue. I am really excited to be chatting today with Officer Colleen Kearns from the Newcastle County Police Thank you, Colleen, for joining us. And we are looking forward to hearing from you with your real lived experience on serving lethal violence protection orders. Before we jump in, I just want to outline for all of our participants today what a lethal violence protection order is. It is essentially a civil order that temporarily prohibits individuals who pose a danger to themselves or others from possessing or purchasing firearms and ammunition. There are two types of LVPOs: an emergency LVPO, which may be issued in an immediate ex parte basis and lasts up to 15 days, and a non-emergency one, which is issued after notice and a hearing. I want to emphasize to all of our participants today that during the COVID crisis, when the courts closed in Delaware, the Justice of the Peace courts remained open so that orders just like these could still be served with due process. It's really critical to know that our entire state government was on board with that from the very beginning. And when other things closed during COVID, lethal violence protection orders continued to be served and continued to be enforced. It's an indication of just how critically important this kind of legislation is. And we're very grateful to the General Assembly for passing it several years ago. Officer Kearns, tell us a little bit more about this law and give us some history of your experience with it.
So Officer Colleen Kearns with the Newcastle County Police Department. I work in the behavioral health unit. So my partner is actually a social worker, Adam Smiley. So he's a clinical social worker on site that helps us with not only these investigations, but any mental health calls. Basically, if a 911 call comes in and the person is suicidal, our officers are trained to go out there and assess that person. If they need help, we're trained to either have me and social worker Smiley come to the scene or call mobile crisis. Once we do the investigation and we talk to all the parties involved, we find out, is the person suicidal? Do they have a plan? Do they have access to weapons? Did they make statements? So if they're calling for themselves and they're asking for help and they're being transported willingly, we will not execute a lethal protective order unless that person asked us to take their guns. If the person is homicidal and suicidal and the family has, documented statements, we talk to the family members. What did they say? What are their behaviors in the last few days that make you believe that they're a danger to themselves and others? Once we get that information and we know that they have access to weapons, we will execute the lethal protective order. So it's basically a temporary order that will suspend that person's rights for 15 days of having the weapon. Once we send the warrant off to the JP courts and the judge signs it, that will give us the rights to remove that weapon from that person's house. And it will be held either at our headquarters or with a family member that signs that they would take possession of the weapon. We try to maintain all the weapons for that first 15 days at our headquarters to make sure that that person does not have access to that weapon. I will say in the last year and a half, I've executed 5 lethal protective orders, and 1 investigation that I did not find was justified for a lethal protective order. So it is an investigation that we take seriously. We do not just take a person's gun rights away because a family member wants to. They have to have an access to the weapon, and they have to be homicidal, suicidal, or have intent to use that weapon against themselves or others. We do have other ways that people have called us and asked us, like, they're not doing well and they know they're not doing well. We actually had a veteran call 2 weeks ago and he didn't have anywhere safe to put his weapon. So we kept the weapon for safekeeping. So we work with anybody and everybody to make sure that if the weapon's in the house and the person knows that either that they're a danger to themselves or their family believes that they're a danger, that we could execute the lethal protective orders. We set up the court date within 15 days. the person goes and seeks mental health treatment, most 99% of the time, they're going to go that day either on a 24 or voluntary to a mental health hospital, whether it's RI, Middlewood, or Rockford, to get a mental health evaluation. And the doctor and that person will respond to court approximately 15 days later and talk with the judge and the AGs of what the next steps are. On all 5 of my lethal protective orders, nobody has fought to get their gun rights back right away. One gentleman got his gun rights back approximately a year and a half later when he was more stable, and him and his doctors felt like it was safe to do. He was an active hunter, so that was a part of his life. So we got him the mental health support, and he continued with counseling. So we got his gun rights back when it was appropriate to do so. And the other 4 turned their gun rights over because they knew that they were not stable. So it is a collaboration of the mental health field, the AG's office, to talk to that person and that person's family to figure out how do we go forward and maintain safety for the community and that person. So we do ask tough questions. So sometimes it's a little awkward for the family, as you know, suicide attempts in the past, the statements that are making. Can we see the text messages that you were sent? So sometimes people are a little bit embarrassed to show us what exactly happening. We have heard it all, and we just want to make sure that you're safe and your loved ones are safe. So yes, we're going to ask, you know, did that person state that they were going to kill themselves or others?
I think that's a really important point and something we emphasize a lot in our programming. And I know that NAMI emphasizes a lot in their programming is a couple of minutes of awkward can save someone's life. A couple of minutes of embarrassment can save someone's life. And it's so critically important that we get comfortable with being a little uncomfortable when it comes to this kind of intervention. And I appreciate you mentioning that. I'm looking forward to the questions our participants certainly must have about lethal violence protection orders. And I am really excited to talk also with Representative Lynn. Sean, can you join us on camera? Another piece of critical legislation that saves lives in Delaware is a safe storage law. Safe storage requires people who live in homes or are in vehicles with people who are prohibited from firearm ownership or children to maintain safe storage practices, which includes keeping guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Safe storage is a critical piece of legislation in preventing suicide and suicide attempts, and it's also critical in preventing unintentional shootings that may happen by curious children. So thank you, Representative Lynn, for joining us. I hope you'll talk a little bit with our participants today about the safe storage law that you prime sponsored. I think it was just about a year ago. Am I right?
It unbelievably, yes. It's been about a year now.
Tell us a little bit more about the process of that and why you think it's so important.
Sure. So Tracy and everybody here with us this afternoon, the way this bill came about is kind of somewhat unusual in that originally this bill was sponsored by my former colleague and friend, Representative Barbieri. Unfortunately, Representative Barbieri, prior to his retirement, wasn't able to get this bill through. The way that I was involved in it was simply tangentially in that at the original hearing on the safe storage bill, I received a call from now Representative David Bentz, and then my legislative aide at the time, Leanne Moore, wherein David and Leanne asked me to come up to the hearing room where safe storage was being heard because they had some concerns about questions that were being asked, and they felt that I could be helpful in helping this bill get passed. Regrettably, at that juncture, safe storage didn't get passed. And when I picked up the torch for Representative Barbieri, in the next year, we similarly weren't able to get it passed. And finally, we were able to do so last session. And essentially what this bill does is it says that if you have a loaded firearm in your home, and there are children present in your home, or there are unauthorized persons present in your home, unauthorized persons being individuals who, by virtue of a felony conviction or a mental health diagnosis, are unable to carry firearms, that if you have one of these individuals in your home, or a child in your home, then you have an affirmative duty to secure loaded firearms in your home. And that entails either taking that loaded firearm and putting it in a gun safe or a lockbox, or having a tamper-resistant trigger lock, or placing the firearm in a location within which a reasonable person believes that that firearm would be secure from access by an unauthorized person. What makes this bill directly relevant to our conversation today, Tracy, is that if a firearm owner doesn't do this, and a child or an unauthorized person, somebody suffering from a disability by virtue of a mental health diagnosis or hospitalization, gets a hold of that loaded firearm that wasn't secured, and they use it to inflict physical injury on another, or more aptly to today's conversation, on themselves, then the firearm owner, is liable to be prosecuted for a Class A misdemeanor, which means that they can be punished by up to 1 year in jail and up to a $2,500 fine. And I believe that's the seriousness within which this bill and this issue ought to be treated, in that if you have someone in your home regularly, either they live there or they're a regular visitor, that you know to have a mental health diagnosis, or have that individual has been hospitalized previously, or you have a child in your home, that you have an affirmative duty to secure loaded firearms so that those individuals don't hurt themselves. And I believe that it's imperative that gun owners be aware of this and take affirmative steps to protect children and others from gaining access to loaded firearms. The story that we just heard about Sean was just so heartbreaking. We don't want anyone to, and especially a mother or a father, to ever go through something like that again. So any steps that we can put in place to protect our children or those who are suffering from depression or anxiety or other types of mental illness, we want to do. And that was the genesis of this bill.
Thank you. I think so many of the folks on our call today, and those who will see the recording of this video in the future, can relate to the curiosity of children. And as a parent myself, I know just how much trouble my kids were able to get into in mere moments of being unsupervised as young kids. And I'm grateful that they were never in a position to really hurt themselves irreparably. We did have to call poison control on more than one occasion, but that's what happens when you have 3 kids in 3 years. So I'm really grateful to you for both priming this bill, but also for always standing for gun safety in the legislature. I know it's not an easy position to take, and your stalwart support of gun violence prevention, again, not a left or right issue, a life or death issue, does not go unnoticed by those of us in advocating on this issue, and we're very grateful.
Thank you. It's not necessarily an easy position to be in down here in Kent County.
Well, but I think Chris Locke's comments were really important. Laws like this one protect the rights of hunters and sportsmen, but also work to save their lives. The laws that we are talking about today, lethal violence protection orders and safe storage laws, are designed specifically to prevent unintentional or impulsive injuries in the homes of legal gun owners. And we're very grateful that the state of Delaware has made these a priority, both in passage and service. So thank you to both you and Officer Kearns for all of your work on the passage and on the implementation of these legislations. running almost on time, to welcome Jalen Powell to the screen. Jalyn is a young woman of color, lives in Southern Delaware, also not a very, it's not always easy to be an advocate for gun safety legislation in Sussex County or Kent County, as Representative Lynn just said. But Jalyn also brings a unique perspective to this conversation in that she was part of the Polytechnic High School. Did I get the name of the school right? During a rash of teen suicide several years ago.
So thank you, Tracy, and everyone and panelists for allowing me the space to share. First, I believe a lot of my work really, and I appreciate all the solutions, the safe storage law, the education we've got on potential solutions to end some of the issues as it relates to gun violence and suicide prevention. A lot of my work focuses on problem though. While solutions are definitely needed, we have to first understand where the problem areas lie in order to form conducive solutions. And I was a part of, in 2012, I was a rising junior in high school. I went to Milford Senior High School around the time where the Polytech High School had, unfortunately, I believe it was 3 students who committed suicide. And in 2012, collectively, as data shows, there were 127 young people who attempted to commit suicide, with 11 resulting in death just in that single year alone. So mental health is a huge, huge problem amongst the United States, Delaware specifically. And we have to first understand mental health in general is a hard concept to understand as adults. So you get into kids and then the minority community who doesn't necessarily have conversations at home about how you're feeling. A lot of us are taught to suppress emotions in order to be seen as strong. You know, showing crying or showing emotion is resembled as a sign of weakness in a lot of the Black communities. And understanding that cultural competence is something that mental health professionals, something that school counselors, something that law enforcement, professionals in your everyday lives need to understand that different cultures are going to express themselves differently. Even with the Black community, signs of pain in the hips and the legs are also signs of depression, which mental health professionals aren't aware of. So understanding that, you know, depression, anxiety are all shown in different ways. We have to educate ourselves around the risk factors. And my position with Delaware, the state of Delaware, and the Division of Services for Children, Youth, and Families, my first training was around education around stigma, as it relates to mental health. And in the Black community, we have our own stigmas. So not only are we facing barriers within ourselves, whether it's, you know, trying to be strong or not seeking professional help, a lot of us go to our interfaith community leaders. And I had a panel discussion last year with community faith leaders as well as mental health professionals to try to reduce some of that stigma, understanding that although seeking counsel under your leadership at the church is perfectly fine, it's actually encouraged, understanding that that's not enough sometimes, and seeking mental health professionals for help is also encouraged. Sometimes you may need to take medicine. Sometimes you may need to go to therapy, and that's okay. Also understanding that in the Black community that feeling down or feeling trapped in your thoughts is not showing a sign of weakness. It happens, you know, traumatic events, your environment, biological imbalances in the brain or chemical imbalances in the brain are all triggers and effects of mental health crises. And once you understand that it's okay to not be okay, you start to become comfortable with seeking help. And a lot of this, I want to introduce House Bill 100 sponsored by Representative Valerie Longhorse, essentially saying that for every 250 kids in grades K through 5, there should be 1 full-time school counselor. And for every 700 kids, there should be 1 full-time psychologist. Things like this, address it, making sure there is adequate representation in these schools for kids to seek mental health professional help if needed, is things that can start to address these problems at home. And then community listening sessions, educating the community and understanding that we have to have language that is comprehensive to these communities so they understand how to identify risk factors and triggers. So we're able to have these conversations at home first and let it spill over into the school and into the professional world. So as I guess I'll wrap up, I know we're on a time frame, but just as a person of color, as a young person, understanding what I would love to stress is that mental health is the root problem here. I know I went to the doctor, the ER, and he told me I can't give you any medicine until I know what the problem is first. And it's the same thing with this. We can't start to form solutions until we know and address the problem first. So thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Jalyn. We're so excited to have you on our team in a global sense, and excited to have you on today's panel. At this time, I'd like to invite all of our panelists back to showing their faces, so we can move into the discussion portion of our program today. And thank you to all of you for sharing so much about the work that you do, and the beliefs that you have about how we can work together to save lives. I want to mention one other thing that I did not mention in my presentation earlier, which is there are some best practices involved here. Storing guns safely is certainly a best practice, but also for those that don't own guns but may interact with other people, there are more guns than humans in America. It's important to recognize that gun ownership is prevalent and widespread. It's always just a good idea to ask about the presence of guns in homes where you leave your children. As a mom, I asked before I dropped my kids off at play dates back when you could have those things before the COVID crisis. And I also ask at homes where my daughter might babysit now that she's a little bit older. And it's just a good practice to get into. I also always offer the information that we do not own guns. I also share about other allergies, peanut allergies, pet allergies, because these are things that we can all work together to do in a fairly benign way to keep kids safe when they're visiting our homes or when our children are visiting other homes. So again, thank you, and I'm excited to get to talking about these issues.
Jalen Powell. And before today's discussion, can I ask you, were you both aware of these policies and of safe storage and lethal violence protection orders?
I was not. And I want to thank Representative Lynn for his hard work in getting it done. I think it's amazing. Your first name is Sean and my son's name was Sean, and you're the one that put that law in place. And I thank you very much for that. And I did not know about it now.
Thank you, Jalyn.
No, ma'am, I wasn't as well as even before my me coming on with the Delaware Coalition Against Gun Violence. Actively or independently, I didn't look for these laws or even these issues or statistics. So being in the room, understanding that suicide prevention and the correspondence between gun violence or possession of firearm is very important and a prevalent problem in Delaware has been something that I'm humbled and grateful to have been in this space to learn.
Wonderful. So representing community members, can I ask, what do you have any thoughts on how we can help spread this message? So clearly we have more work to do, Tracy. we want to not only have these policies in place, but we want our community members to know. So do you all have any thoughts about ways we can continue to spread these messages?
Well, one I have is, and Representative Lynn, you may be able to answer this question. When one purchases a gun, is one made aware of this law?
No.
But that's a great question. And
Yeah,
Sean,
that
you
leads
know a little bit more about where I'm going with this. There's a bill that just passed the House 2 weeks ago and will come up to the Senate in a couple of weeks called the Gun Shop Project. Sean, do you know, you may know more about the nuance of that than I do. If you have information, I'd love to hear it.
Sure, I do. So again, it's kind of an odd coincidence for Chris that my colleague, the other Sean in the House, Sean Matthews, one of my good friends, sits next to me in the House. The other Sean, and we use that term laughingly because there's a few of us in the House. He has introduced a bill that basically says when you purchase a firearm, that they have to give you information about suicide. And that bill just passed the House. It's on its way to passage in the Senate and will hopefully be law in the state. We're hoping as early as March. But that's Representative Sean Matthews that's pioneering and championing that effort. it's not a bad idea. Simply that other gun laws like safe storage also be explained to potential gun owners at time of purchase. And maybe that's something that we will kind of pursue in this session. You know, I look at Tracy and Annie and, you know, Megan and all of our folks at Moms Demand Action too, and let's try to make that happen.
Well, and when that law passes, which I have every belief that it will, it's been supported universally across the aisle on both sides. I really do believe that people may have different perspectives on the politics of gun ownership, but nobody thinks that gun violence is the right thing, and nobody wants to see more of that. And that really fuels our work in advocating for stronger gun laws. When the Gun Shop Project does pass, it will be given to the Delaware Suicide Prevention Coalition to implement, and I am going to be the lead person on that implementation.
Awesome.
You can be sure that we'll be dotting our I's on some of these issues. Chris, that was a great question. There are many times in the process of legal and appropriate gun ownership where we can put a moment of pause in place to make sure that anyone who has access to a gun knows the risks and knows the responsibilities. That's
I
something
see
we
that.
work on all the time.
I see that there's a question about educating those that already own guns. I'm part of the NRA, so I do talk about gun safety and do free education classes for anybody part of the NRA to make sure that there's regular information about gun safety out there. And then our police department does offer a personal safety, which goes over gun ownership and responsibilities of the owner. So from our police department, we do try to communicate that to everybody that wants to know that information. And the other thing I would like to add about the gun safety in the homes that a lot of people who don't own guns don't understand is that the kids play with guns, and their guns that they play with are very light, and you could pull the trigger very easily. Most kids that are curious gets their hands on a real firearm. That trigger that you have to pull is about 8 to 12 pounds. So they usually cannot pull that with one hand. So they use two hands. And sometimes they use their thumbs. So they turn the gun and the gun is facing them. So their curiosity from playing with fake guns that are very easy to pull to real guns is very dangerous because of how heavy that trigger pull is. That puts their life in danger pretty quickly. So we do try to make sure that everybody that we come in contact with that has guns, and we do safety presentations about gun safety regularly in the community pre-COVID, with COVID
Right.
limited.
There are also programs for children, in specifically Safety Town, which is, I believe, a statewide program, and it's for certain a Newcastle County program. It's a very, very affordable summer camp program for kids that's designed for children around kindergarten age. And gun safety is something that is addressed in that safety programming for young children.
Thank
And I
you.
believe they use the Eddie Eagle program, which is an NRA program.
That's correct, they do.
Yeah. And, you know, when the NRA was founded, it was primarily a gun safety organization. I think the NRA has changed some over the years, as so many organizations have. But safety is really at the core of what so many gun owners believe to be valuable. And it's something that often gets overlooked by sort of the vocal minority. By and large, most gun owners that we interact with, and we interact with quite a few, I'm sure you do as well, Officer Kearns, believe that safety is a priority. It's a great question that just came in from Louise Cummings, and I wonder if what we should consider doing now.
Yeah, should we stop the recording perhaps and
I think we should.
open up the floor for some discussion?
I think so. That would be great.
Okay. So